Hello, welcome to Men in Balance, and today my guest is Joe Wiseman, who actually is the Men in Balance guy in Cincinnati, Ohio. Hey, Joe, how are you?
Good, Jerry. How are you?
Good, thanks for coming on. Joe is in charge of the Cincinnati chapter of Men in Balance, which he inherited from Carmen DiGiandomenico, who founded that chapter years ago. And so, Joe, I thank you for coming on because it's good to catch up with the guys in Cincinnati. I don't often talk to you guys.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's great to see you.
So, talk to me a little bit about what's going on at the moment with your chapter, and then we'll talk about the history of it and how things have evolved.
Sure. Well, so like everything else these days, right now we're only meeting virtually. Uh, we meet typically, we met when we were live, we met once a month and had a big meeting. But what we realized a year ago when COVID hit is that guys need to, we all need community.
Yeah.
But guys in our group especially need to see each other more than once a month. So now we're actually meeting twice a month, one big meeting, main meeting, and then we'll have a catch up meeting 2 weeks later on Saturday mornings.
Hmm. What are the main topics you're talking about now? What happens in your meetings at the moment?
Yeah, good question. We have actually really latched on and grown very fond of Father Richard Rohr.
Oh, good.
So I'm sure you know Father Richard Rohr. Yeah, one of our members, I think it was Larry that introduced us to Falling Upwards. I think was the first book we read a couple years back, and fell in love with his philosophy, his writings. So we've actually been going through the 12 steps. Well, actually, it's called Breathing Underwater, but it is a parallel between the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, of
Yeah.
AA,
Okay.
and growing your faith, your spirituality. It's a
Um,
fascinating read.
yeah.
So we've been doing that for 8 months.
How are the guys receiving that? Would you say?
Very well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a huge success. Very, very well taken.
One of the things that I've always admired about that chapter, and I think it goes back to Carmen, who we'll talk about in a little bit, the guy
Hmm.
who started the chapter. There is no shame about talking about spirituality in that group.
No.
I flew up there, I don't know, 8 or 10 years ago, and you guys are wide open, and I was glad to see it and glad to catch up
Yeah.
with you guys. So talk a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of issues that men can latch hold of in this Richard Rohr stuff.
So one of the common themes that Richard talks about is that second half of life,
Hmm.
which is going from the acquiring, the phase where you're really focused on your title and your possessions and things, to that second half of life where you realize none of that stuff matters, and that the only thing that matters is really your love and your faith and your relationships. So that concept has been consistent through everything that he writes. And I'd say just that concept in general is what I have found that the guys latch onto the most, is realizing it's a transition period. We all get there at different times and different ways. It's usually a very uncomfortable transition period. We've talked a lot about necessary suffering, which is oftentimes the catalyst for transitioning into that second half of life. And we've gotten into a lot of discussions about that because guys don't really look forward to suffering. We
Yeah,
don't like that thought, but most of us, if not all of us, have really started to accept the fact that it's definitely a part of life, but it's also something we need to embrace more and value more, that suffering and what we learn from it.
yeah, yeah. There's a lot to be said for endurance, isn't there?
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
unfortunately, I think sometimes guys see it as just a trial to get through, but the lessons learned along the way—that's where the action is, right?
Yeah,
So, yeah,
yeah.
it makes a big difference. Um, so let's talk a minute about Carmen. For those of you who don't know, Carmen DiGiandomenico was the founder of the Cincinnati chapter, And I'm not even sure how you knew Carmen. Did you work with him, or what was your connection?
I was one of the few people that did not work with Carmen. I
Mm,
was actually invited by somebody who did work with Carmen to
right.
my first Men in Balance group.
So here's a guy who was a go-getter, wide open go-getter. You just had to say that. He was vice president of a couple different companies, and what amazed me, Joe, was that this guy would take time on Friday afternoons to call everybody on the list to make sure they were going to be at the meeting on Saturday morning. That's
Hmm.
just phenomenal. And he had, when I was up there, he had like 100 people there at the meeting. So
Yeah,
he was growing big kind of guy, wasn't he?
he was an amazing recruiter.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Sure.
the term I use.
What is your recollection of Carmen? What was your impression of him?
So it's funny you ask that. When I was invited to come to the meeting by a gentleman named Dave Jones, who was a friend of mine from our boys played soccer together, I instantly went because I love Dave and I trust Dave. And I've always loved men's group meetings, and I wasn't a part of one at the time. So I showed up, and there were about, not quite 100, but I think there were about 20, 25 guys at that first meeting. And Carmen was leading the meeting. And I was instantly very impressed and intrigued by Carmen because he had a presence. And then I'd say 2 or 3 meetings later, he invited some of us to go golfing. So I fortunately was able to go, and I got to ride in the cart with Carmen. And I tell the story. Up until that point, I thought Carmen was like a plumber or maybe a blue collar worker. Not that that's a bad thing by any means, but he was kind of rough around the edges a little bit, but an extremely humble guy.
Hmm.
Not arrogant in the least, and definitely never made you feel like he was better than you.
Right.
So I just kind of assumed he was, an average run-of-the-mill guy. Um, and then I asked him when I was in the golf cart, I said, "So Carmen, what exactly do you do?" He told me what he did. And I just remember sitting there going, seriously? You're
Right.
the vice president of Fidelity?
Right.
I
Right.
had no idea. But that was the kind of guy he was. He is a very welcoming, comforting, humble man.
Yeah. Humble is a good word. And so my connection with Carmen started because my company did some consulting work for Fidelity, and
Hmm.
Carmen was the impetus of getting that customer service training going. And so we worked for weeks on end with Carmen. But then one night at dinner, I started telling him about Men in Balance, and you could see this fire light up in his eyes.
I bet.
And it was like, I want some of that, you know? And
Yeah.
not only did he want some of that, he wanted to start a chapter, and then he took it on to Baltimore and started another chapter. Um, so this
Hmm.
was the kind of leadership he was. He called it servant leadership, which I
Yeah.
really appreciated because he saw himself as a servant to the folks that he managed, not as their boss or anything of that nature. But he took that idea right into every aspect of his life, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And, I remember at the celebrations we had after his funeral, at both of them in Baltimore and here in Cincinnati, there were so many people, countless number of people that came up and said that exact thing, that that's what they loved about him. That's what they remember is
So,
how much of a servant he was to helping them get what they want.
yeah, and it didn't matter who you were. I mean, you could
Right.
be any level of status. Carmen,
Yeah.
he was out to help you. I'll tell you a little story about him, which I thought was funny. Um, he he got some feedback once that he was not um, rewarding his people enough, or at least not commending them enough in the work that they were doing.
Yeah.
And so um, he talked to us about that and asked some questions and so forth. So he came up with this idea. He put 10 pennies in his pocket every morning, in the right pocket, and each time he would meet somebody that he could commend for something they were doing, he would move a penny over to the other pocket. And he made sure he did at least 10 of those every day, which I thought, okay, it's mechanical, but it got the job done, and
Yeah.
it made a big difference.
Well, and that was the thing that I was amazed. Carmen was very honest, and he really opened up. And, when I saw him, when I first met him, he was really good at this stuff. but he would tell stories about how it didn't come natural to him, and he had a lot of help and a lot of people coach him, but he really worked at it, and he
Yeah,
worked at it because it was really important to him, and he became great at it because he worked at it.
that's right.
You know?
That's exactly right. And another little story that sort of fits into that is once he got the Cincinnati chapter going, then he would panic that he didn't have a program for the upcoming week, and he would call me and say, what am I going to talk about Saturday?" It wasn't like this guy wasn't a fountain of knowledge. I mean, he could have pulled out of his own experience and kept anybody entertained for days. But
So what did you tell him, Jerry? I'm
yeah,
curious when he called you.
well, we would just talk about things, lessons he had learned, and things in his life. And I said, "How about pulling some of that out, and we'll put it in a package called whatever." And you know, and what was interesting was I didn't give him anything. I just pulled out of him what he already knew and repackaged it so he could take it Saturday morning and feel comfortable with it. So that was fascinating to be in that kind of relationship with him.
So you want to know the funny thing about that?
But
I used to do the exact same thing to him when
oh,
he moved to
really?
Baltimore.
So
And he did the exact same thing to me that you did to him. So he
wow,
learned well.
yeah.
Yeah.
I, I don't want to turn the guy into a saint, but he was a unique individual. And, we lost him, in 2016, is that right?
Yep.
Yeah,
January of 2016.
yeah. And the idea that you guys were standing around his bed when he died, this is not family. This is not, long-term business associates. This is the close guys from the Men in Balance chapter standing around his bed when he died. And that was just so powerful. It was just an amazing testament to his impact on people.
Yeah. Well, and just to make sure we have the facts correct. So we were all there right before he passed away. And fortunately, we had a retreat at Malvern the weekend before he passed away. So all of the men from Cincinnati were able to go and visit him. Just to be correct, he actually passed away about a day after everybody had left.
Right.
And
That's right.
Mary, yeah, his wife and his children were the only ones there when he actually did
Yeah. Thank you.
leave. Yeah, but I'm positive that he held on until all of us from Cincinnati could come in and say goodbye to him.
Yeah.
Which was great to be able to do that.
Well, and we talk a lot in Men in Balance about the brevity of life and the uncertainty of life, and certainly his life turned out to replicate that because
Hmm.
nobody had any idea that this healthy, um,
Right.
athletic guy was about to die of cancer. And I mean, he died very quickly after he was diagnosed. But you know, in looking at him, you wouldn't know that that on a hockey court, for example, he could go for blood, but in real life, he was just a gentle teddy bear, just a unique individual.
Yeah. Yeah. I can't tell you the amount of people that I have run into when I say the name Carmen DiGiandomenico in Cincinnati
Yeah,
that know him from the hockey rink that say,
yeah,
"Oh yeah, I coached against that guy," and there were quite a few that
that,
weren't too happy about coaching against him.
yeah. There was a time when that was pretty much his whole life,
Right?
Um,
Yeah.
so let's talk about, maybe we can use Carmen as an example, but what do you think um, these guys are learning in their quest, especially using Richard Rohr as an example and Carmen as a real life example? What do you think the learnings are for us as men when we do that kind of in-depth study and get rid of our vulnerabilities and all of that?
Yeah. Good question. So I think again, taking on the theme of Richard Rohr and that second half of life, um, what seems to be one of the most impactful lessons and that the themes that we talk about the most is the the value of authenticity
Mm,
and of just learning to be comfortable with who you are and realize that we all have we all have a lot of harmful traits. We all have a lot of faults. We all have made a lot of mistakes. And that the more we hide them, the more we ignore them, the more we try to keep them in the shadows, the worse it is.
Yeah.
We just have to be honest with ourselves and accept ourselves for who we are and embrace it and realize we are the good and the bad.
Yeah.
I mean, Richard Rohr is really big on paradoxes. The good and the bad have to exist together. So that's one of the things that we talk about a lot. I think it's helped guys, like you said before, they're very open with their spirituality. They're very open with a lot of things, which is a great part of this meeting and this group. And it's helped the guys to open up and to talk about those failures, those insecurities, those things that they don't feel comfortable talking about.
Yeah. I don't know if you found this to be true or not, but when I started Men in Balance and I was telling people what I wanted to do, get guys in a room where they're going to talk openly about their spirituality and about their vulnerabilities and their concerns in life, and people say, yeah, well, lots of luck with that.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Because, people were saying they won't talk. And I said, well, I'm going to gamble that they will. And so what I learned was that if you get them in the room and they realize that everybody else has the same problems they do, or something similar, then they not only do they talk, they'll talk over each other.
Right.
I wonder
Yep.
if you found the same thing there.
Absolutely. Yeah. And also you got to have that element of trust. It's interesting. I'm trying to think of legacies of Carmen. So he established ground rules that we would always go over whenever somebody new came to a meeting. And we still do the same thing today. And we have the exact same ground rules. But a big part of it is, what's said in that room or on that video call stays. We never repeat it outside. And we also don't get into subjects where you're going to, we don't talk about the differences in religions. We don't talk about politics. And so there are certain things that are definitely off limits that we don't get into. But we always make a point to say, hey, this is a safe room and everybody knows it. And you can share anything you want. And we're not going to try to solve it. We just want you to feel comfortable talking about it.
So what do you think the benefit is of that for men, especially men who are in midlife or facing, marriage problems or children that don't behave or whatever?
Yeah. Well, I think what you said is exactly the benefit, to realize that, hey, I'm not the only one. Because I think naturally men like to, they'll pull away when they're having challenges.
Yeah.
And they kind of go in their cave. And they don't like it. They don't necessarily, they know it doesn't make them feel better, but they do it naturally. So when you get into a group of guys that you realize, hey, these dudes are, just like me, and then they start talking about the fact they have the same exact issues and that they trust, it's just realizing I'm normal, and my problems are the same, and other people have gone through the exact same thing, and I can get through it too.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to see that these guys during the work week are sort of expected to be Mr. Tough, Mr. Armor, Mr. No, no vulnerability, and yet they you come into this room and you got to drop all that and be something totally different and be your genuine self. I mean, I think it's actually a relief to them to get to let down some of those guards, don't you think?
Oh yeah. It's funny. One of our sessions was on Brene Brown and vulnerability, and it was a tough interlude starting to talk about it. But to your point, when they started thinking about the concept of being vulnerable, it was very refreshing. It was relaxing and nice to know, hey, I can do that here, because you go out into the workforce and it's not as easy. But that's another thing I think along the same lines that men in our group have realized. The more vulnerable they are, one, it's a sign of strength.
Yes.
There again, it's a paradox, but it also allows them to be more in tune with who they are and be themselves and just be natural. And everything works so much better when they're in that state. But it's not easy at all.
It's not easy, but I think the research is pretty clear on that. That's the only time we really learn anything. Otherwise, we just keep repeating the same mistakes over and over, right?
Right.
Yeah. And you talk about vulnerability, and I had a group at my home church um, back in the early days of Men in Balance, and it was a breakfast meeting, and there must have been 100 guys there. And I said, one of the things you have to do is to learn to be vulnerable. And I got silence. I mean, it's like, what, you know? And so after the meeting, one of the guys came up to me and said, "Well, you ruined it for me when you said vulnerable." I mean, it's like, I ain't going to do that.
Right,
But men are so trained not to do that. And, you know, the tragedy, Joe, to me, is they're trained to do that, or they feel they have to do that, even with their spouses or the people
right.
who are the most intimate. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And, it's interesting. One of the sessions that sticks out in my mind the most was when we did a session on who taught you how to be a husband?
Yeah.
And we realized, and I can't remember what book we were using, but we thought about it, and everybody pretty much answered the same, that you looked at your father for the most part, how to be a dad, how to be a husband, and then we said, well, where did your father learn this? From his dad. And we
Yeah.
realized our expectations and our the things that we're looking at are two generations old, so about 50
Right.
years out of date. And then
And
we talked about it, that what does your wife expect you to be,
yes.
and how is that different from how your grandfather acted? And
Yeah.
that's when we all said, oh my gosh, yeah, that's why I feel so uncomfortable. My wife wants this, but society and everything else is telling me I should be like this as a husband. And that it's not even near each other.
Yeah, I'm wondering what you think of this. I'm seeing a little bit of a break in that shield. I'm seeing more guys that are willing to be open and vulnerable and close to their spouses and not have this macho nature about it. I don't know. Am I wrong on
Yeah.
that? Are you seeing more of that?
No, I do see it, and thank God I do.
Yeah.
It's a good thing. I, and I don't know what's compelling that, but yeah, definitely more so than when I was growing up and looking at my father. Um, but yeah, I do think they are, and maybe society is starting to ease up on the expectations that men have to be macho. I don't think it's nearly as expected as it used to be.
Yeah. Well, certainly, it's an idea whose time has come. When you say,
Right? Yeah.
I had a situation at my home church when I started this. A woman came up to me at church one day and said, "I don't know what you're doing with my husband up there, but keep doing it."
That's
So,
great.
and I found, by the way, that women are great allies for this. We even had a session. One of the guys said, "Why don't we ever hear what the women are thinking about this?" I said, "Okay, we'll do that." So we brought in a couple of women and in a session with the men, and we said, "Okay, have at it. Tell us what's wrong with us men." And they did, and the guys were just amazed that these women would be so direct and straightforward to them. And it was the same stuff their wife had been told.
That's great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So it is interesting, isn't it? It sometimes we're our own worst enemy in what we are unwilling to learn.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's funny you say that because for a while there, Mary DiGiandomenico was coming to our meetings. And I think the guys, I know I personally learned a ton. And
Yeah,
I would always make a point of asking Mary, because
yeah,
sometimes she can, be a little quiet, a little reserved if you know Mary.
yeah.
She's beautiful in that way. But whenever I asked her what her thoughts were, I mean, the room got silent and everybody was dying to know, what does a woman think? How does she feel?
Yeah,
She's very insightful.
and something about men that think that women have this secret to relationships or something that they never got, and actually that's probably right to an extent.
Hmm.
I don't think us guys are ever taught how to do relationships and how to negotiate a relationship. In fact, I have said in some of my writings that the only emotion that men are sort of given a free pass to exhibit is anger, and that's not a good emotion.
No,
I mean,
no,
if
you're
that's all
right.
you got to work with, man, you're sort of hurting.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, they don't teach us relationships in high school and in college, from
And
what
I
I can
really think
remember.
they should. I mean, I would, if I were the czar of education, I would make a class on relationships in every year of high school. I mean, I mean, it's the most important thing
I agree.
for the rest of your life, and we don't
Yeah.
focus on that at all. And the marriage statistics certainly bear that out, don't they?
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah. So, anything planned for the future that's new and different for what you're going to do with your group?
Well, so the good thing about COVID, I think, and thinking about what are we going to do for the next year, it has enabled us to reconnect and to stay connected with a lot of guys who have moved away.
Hmm.
So one of the definites that we're going to do is continue having, even when we are able to get back in person, to have a virtual component,
Yeah.
because we've been able to stay in contact with guys from Baltimore, guys that live down in Florida. Um, where else? We've had guys from Alabama join us. So it's great to be able to do that. As far as our content, it's funny. I try not to plan too much
Yeah.
ahead because exactly what Carmen taught me. I found that if I choose content that is applicable to what I'm dealing with, or maybe what some of the guys are dealing with in that moment or in that period, it tends to be the most beneficial.
It's sort of a miracle, isn't it? I mean, you get these guys together without an agenda, and somebody mentions an issue or something, and all of a sudden there's a very involved discussion about that, and a lot of
Yeah,
outpouring of emotion and reaction and support for each other. I mean, I think it's really cool how
yeah,
guys support each other in that situation.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I say we make a point to tell guys we're not there to fix it because
Yeah,
that's one of the problems. Guys try to fix it too
oh,
much,
it
but
is.
I can say we've definitely helped each
Yeah.
other a lot.
Oh
Yeah,
man, Joe, thank you so much for the work you're doing up there. I mean, I know it sometimes gets discouraging. I would say hang with it. That you're making
oh,
a difference in these guys' lives, and for heaven's sakes, we all know that we need that, right?
yes, sir. Yeah, thank you. No, I love it, and we appreciate your support and your prayers over the years.
Yeah, thank you, man. That's Joe Wiseman, who's the head of the Cincinnati group of Men in Balance and has been for a while, and his predecessor that we sort of talked about with Carmen DiGiandomenico, who is a great role model for you to follow, right? So,
Absolutely.
yeah. Thanks again, Joe. Good to see you. I'm Jerry
Thank you,
Hancock
Jerry.
for Men in Balance.